Everybody. So, I'm Dr. Diwakar Dalila from King George Medical University, Lucknow. Uh, I've been sharing with you some insights on medical management of overactive bladder and will take you how treatment has evolved over the years and what are the current status. Now, before I go further, let me show you what are the objectives of my talk this evening. I'll be focusing on three areas: behavioral therapy, antimuscarinic therapy, and beta-3 agonist therapy. In behavioral therapy, I'll touch upon various options. What is the evidence that these options work, and how should you use these options? I'll touch upon antimuscarinic therapy, different options of it, what are their drawbacks, what is the way to use them in clinical practice. Then I touch upon beta-3 agonists, how do they work? Is there something relevant in pharmacodynamics that a practicing urologist should know? And what are the evidence that they work? And before I start elaborating to you treatment, I am presuming that you know about the diagnosis making, what is the right diagnosis. You have to have right patient. I am talking about primary overactive bladder here, and you have to exclude anything else that can masquerade as overactive bladder, particularly interstitial cystitis or subclinical urinary infection or subclinical bladder outflow obstruction, things like that, or neurogenic bladder. So I'm not touching upon diagnosis making. I'm touching upon once you have made a diagnosis and you believe that a patient has primary overactive bladder, then how do you treat? Okay. So before you start treatment, you must classify your patient into two varieties, whether is the patient belongs to wet OAB or dry OAB, because the treatment may be slightly different. You have also to find out whether the patient has some degree of mixed incontinence. Our objectives and goals of treating such patients, both males and females, first is that you must improve or try to eliminate the urge urinary incontinence completely. Then you should try to reduce the urgency and frequency episodes. Then you must ensure that whatever treatment you are giving to the patient is compliant with it. And finally, whatever treatment you are giving should be in consensus with the comorbidities of the patient, should be affordable to the patient, should improve the quality of life of the patient, and it should be efficacious in long term. So we will remember these goals, all four of them, all the time, and every time we are meeting the patient and penning down a prescription for them. The treatment of overactive bladder usually goes into these four areas: behavioral therapy, pharmacotherapy, neuromodulation, or surgery. I'm confining myself to the medical part today, so I'll touch upon the behavioral therapy and pharmacotherapy, which are indeed the initial treatment for all patients. Okay. First, let me explain to you about behavioral therapy, because this is the area which is not well understood. And it comprises of three components. First is lifestyle modification. Second is behavioral intervention. And third is pelvic muscle rehabilitation. All the three actually come under the category of behavioral therapy or conservative therapy. The guidelines AUA plus Society for Urinary Incontinence recommend that all the three should be offered as first-line therapy to all patients, all the three. The lifestyle modification says that you should find out about the fluid intake and suggest the patient what should she do with the fluid intake. Restrict caffeine intake. When I say caffeine intake, I'm not only saying about coffee, but I'm saying anything and everything that contains caffeine, including toffee, chocolates, some toffee, and tea, etc. Dietary changes in the diet, particularly spices in the diet, uh, most spices can aggravate OAB symptoms, so they should be restricted. Chilies particularly be restricted. Pepper must be restricted because pepper increases the symptoms too much. And you have to instruct the patient for weight loss if she's obese. This is very important. So lifestyle modifications, one. Second is behavioral interventions, where you teach the patient to monitor boiling diary at frequent intervals. Once the patient looks at her boiling diary, then she gets a feedback in the mind that I had to somehow control it. They should be taught how to delay the voiding. And this is very important. I use it in my practice very often. I tell the patient that for the first week, you try to suppress the act of micturition when you have a desire to void by only 2 minutes. Next week, make this time 5 minutes. Third week, make this time 10 minutes, and so on. So if on a weekly basis, she or he learns how to postpone the micturition even with the onset of urgency, then she knows how to control the bladder. And of course, the exercise, physical exercise, helps to improve the autonomic function of the pelvis by improving the blood circulation. So these should be done. The third is pelvic muscle rehabilitation, where we teach the patient how to relax their pelvic floor by various mechanisms. Many patients use urge control techniques, like somebody will pull the pubic area or pinch the glans penis or pinch somewhere in the scrotum or thigh, pull the hair, anything that you can stimulate in the area of the genitalia, it suppresses the bladder contraction. This is known. They are called urge control techniques. Patient learn over a period of time, and you have to ask the patient this question upfront: do you know any such trick which can suppress your contraction? And if patient tells you, then you should tell him or her to use it more often. And finally, the biofeedback. Biofeedback, not many institutions and people use it, but Linda Cardozo promoted this very vehemently, and she's a strong believer. And she was using in urodynamic lab. The patient was made to sit in the urodynamic lab, and the pressure monitoring of the bladder was connected to auditory signal. Whenever the bladder pressure will rise, if alarm will ring in the room, siren will ring in the room, and by the severity of the noise of the siren, patient will know how bad is my contraction. So they would try to see somehow that the audio signal is somehow reduced. So this was, she used it and she showed it to be very, very effective. And but as I said, not many labs, not many people in the country do it, but this is useful. So these are 1, 2, 3 mechanisms of comprehend for the conservative therapy. All 3 should be used in the patient. There's enough evidence that if you can control the quantity of fluid and also control the quality of fluid, it will improve the patient. You must have noticed that if you give alkalizers to your patient, the change in the pH improves the overactive bladder symptoms, and there's evidence to that also, that it happens like this only. I mentioned about diet, weight management, physical activity, restriction of pepper in the diet. All these small things help the patient. Bladder retraining, also I mentioned about it. Now you will be wondering that this looks pretty exhaustive thing to do. So what I have learned over the years, that for us as a clinical urologist, it is not possible to devote our time to this part of the treatment. So you must, in your clinic setup, train a male or female nurse staff or assistant who is into it in a quite detail and spends time with the patient separately, and he is the person who will guide the patient about all these 3 comprehensive management. And next time when the patient comes follow up, he would be the first meeting point and check with the patient whether she or he is doing these things appropriately or not, because they definitely support the recovery of the patient. So pharmacotherapy of overactive bladder, as you must already be using it, you know that antimuscarinics are first line therapy for overactive bladder. And when we use this antimuscarinic therapy, you know that we are looking at blocking the M3 receptors in urinary bladder more selectively. But you also have M3 receptors in eye, in the saliva, in the lacrimal glands, and you also have them in the brain, and you also have them in the gut. also in the salivary glands. So even though you use a selective M3 blocker, you have these problems inherent with these medications. Now let me show you this diagram here and tell you that there's a urothelium here and there's a sensory nerve layer here. I'm trying to show with the pointer here. This yellow is the urothelial cell. The green is the cells of Cajal and the submucosal layer, and this blue is the muscle bundle, M2. Now, on the detrusor muscle, you have M2 and M3 receptors. M3 receptors bring about the contraction in the detrusor fiber. M2 receptors are just, you may call them as informer or facilitator. Just like that. If you are a very strong policeman and you know how to fight and you are posted in a check post, you need an informer to come to you, or you need a commander to tell you that, okay, you do go there, you are needed there, you show your might and strength and skill and control the problem, right? So you need an informer and you need a facilitator. This job is done by M2 receptors. M2 receptors themselves do not bring about any contraction. They just facilitate and stimulate, or you call inform M3 receptors. So you have plenty of M2 receptors in urothelium. And that is how the urothelium senses what's going wrong in the urine, the pH, the diet, the components, so many things, infection, bacterial toxins, what's going on in the bladder lumen, and then they stimulate bladder contraction locally. So for overactive bladder, the problem is that in the filling phase, these muscle fibers have very low concentration of exposure of acetylcholine. And when the concentration increases a little bit, they start showing flickering movements. And if the amplitude of flickering movements is a little higher, the patient starts experiencing urgency and urgent continence and so on. So what I'm saying is the trigger may be lying in the urothelium or in the bladder lumen, or the trigger may be lying in the nerve fiber, right? And you have to understand this. I'll explain to this point again when I come to some points. What is the value of M2 receptors in urothelium? So as of now, let's focus on blocking M3 receptors in the muscle. And when we use these drugs, which are to everybody's knowledge, we have these 6 antimuscarinics approved for the use in patients with overactive bladder. We do not have fasotyrosine in India. We have only these 5 drugs in India, anticholinergics: oxybutynin, tolterodine, solifenacin, darifenacin, and trospium chloride. When you give the drug to the patient, it is not only that it will go and block receptors in bladder, but it will block at all the sites that I showed to you, and maybe you will have some undesirable side effects. All urologists remember about dry mouth, constipation, right? And they are also worried about risk of precipitating urinary retention if you are treating a male patient. So these 3 things are ingrained in the minds of all of us. But what we sometimes forget is that some anticholinergics can cause blurred vision, particularly solifenacin. Some anticholinergics can cause tachycardia and palpitation, particularly tolterodine. And some anticholinergics can penetrate the blood-brain barrier and create confusion, delirium, cognitive impairment, particularly tolterodine, oxybutynin kind of things. So remember these 3 also, right? And I'll elaborate this again when we come to different molecules. These are, as I said, 6 FDA-approved antimuscarinic medications. And I mentioned to you that you know about dry mouth and constipation and impending retention with the use of these. But I just like to focus your attention on the red circle that I made in the slide. When you use tolterodine, remember an extra side effect, headache. And this headache is true with tolterodine, fasotyrosine, and trospium chloride also. This is extra problem with these fasotyrosine, tolterodine. Remember about blurred vision with solifenacin. Okay. This is specific to solifenacin somehow, a little more with solifenacin. And remember about dyspepsia with darifenacin. So I just highlighted 5 side effects with the red circle so that you remember these specific with the particular molecule. Over the years, solifenacin has become the choice drug for urologists because this has been shown to be more effective than tolterodine, oxybutynin in head-to-head trials. This takes care of everything: urgency, urgent continence, urgency, and most uh, startling feature was with this that it increases the warning time. Warning time means suppose patient has urgency and patient leaks. Now, there's a time between the urgency feeling and starting of the urination. Now, solifenacin increases this warning time. This is here. This is here, right? Warning time. So this was a drug became very popular the last 8, 10, 7, 8 years. Everybody has been using it quite effectively. But I must tell you one thing about this drug, that this drug has long half-life, 48 hours, 72 hours, and you're giving it daily. So what happens is that over a period of time, it gets accumulated in your body, even though it is metabolized by liver and excreted by urine and liver both, but it tends to get accumulate at the receptor site because of the binding. And then you can have side effects like constipation, dry mouth, which will start after a month, after 6 weeks, and then they increase more. So patient may come back to you after 1 week, 10 days, say, doctor, I'm very fine, there's no problem. But then they experience it after 1 month and they stop the treatment. So you should schedule your meetings with the patient accordingly. And remember this aspect of solifenacin. And also remember about blurred vision with solifenacin. But if you look at the treatment of OAB at the hands of physicians, at the hand of gynecologists, because everybody sees these patients and everybody today is treating it, tolterodine somehow remains the #1 choice with everybody, inclusive. I mean, physician, gynecologist, urologist, tolterodine still remains because this is the molecule which has the largest number of publications on it amongst the anticholinergics. Very well studied molecule, and long-term data is also available. Darifenacin came with the effect that it is very selective M3 receptor blocker, but it does not cross blood-brain barrier. So it would not create cognitive function effects in elderly people, right? So that's how it became a drug of choice for elderly sufferers of OAB in place of solifenacin. Okay, so that is how we currently place today tolterodine, darifenacin, solifenacin. Tolterodine is still going in the market because of the cost advantage. Trospium also came in between, and I use it very often. And there are certain points which are specific to this trospium. One, that this is a quaternary amine, rest all is tertiary amine. So it is a bigger molecule. First of all, you must remember that if you give it after the food, it will not be absorbed properly because it's a big molecule. So patient has to take literally empty stomach. The rest all anticholinergics can be taken with or without food. Better you give them without food. The absorption is better. But in case of trospium, you have to be very specific because a big molecule not absorbed after the food. #1. #2, everything else, all anticholinergics are metabolized by liver, but trospium not. It goes through esterases, so it is excreted in urine nearly 80-90% just like that, without being metabolized by liver, and it gets selectively accumulated within the urine of the urinary bladder. Now look at this aspect. So then it is acting on the receptors on the urothelium. And I touched this point earlier. Now there are patients with overactive bladder where the urothelium is the triggering event. Say for example, somebody had UTI, or somebody had a catheter, or somebody had a bladder stone, which created some edema in the mucosa. The catheter removed, stone removed, UTI corrected, right? The primary factor treated. But even after that, there is some degree of residual problem in the urothelium, because of which it retains its sensitivity for many, many weeks, maybe months. And in that period, patient has symptoms of overactivity. This is what I call as post-urothelial insult overactive bladder. If you have this kind of a problem, here trospium, by virtue of being more in the bladder lumen, will show you better response as compared to other anticholinergics. Okay, that's one. Second is trospium, by virtue of being a bigger molecule, this also does not go through blood-brain barrier and enters the brain or the central nervous system. I mean, so the brain effects are not there. So it has advantage of difenacan. Okay. And thirdly, because it has a little different route of action. See, most of the other antimuscarinics go from blood, through blood capillaries, they go to the detrusor muscle layer, and then they show the action. But trospium comes through the lumen of the urinary bladder, onto the urothelium, and then acting on the muscle. So you can combine trospium with other anticholinergics because the route of the drug is slightly different. So I take this as add-on therapy in some of my patients. It causes side effects like dry mouth. It causes constipation. No denial about this. But then, you can do like this: morning take trospium, night take solifenacin, and then you can, somehow manage it. The most common problem that you will face after you started these therapies, after a week or after 15 days, patient will come back to you and tell, doctor, I don't respond well. I have taken this drug for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I'm not happy. So what do you do? In that scenario, you have two options. One is switch over to another anticholinergic, say for instance, tolterodine to solifenacin. Now you may ask me, sir, they are same receptor blocker. Why do you say that switch over? This is because the metabolism of both the drugs is different. Each individual has its genetic polymorphism, because of which he can be a fast metabolizer or slow metabolizer to these tertiary amines. So you can switch over, and it is possible the patient not responding to tolterodine may respond to solifenacin. Same way, there's an approach called add-on. And add-on, you can add solifenacin over and above tolterodine. Although they are both antimuscarinics, both will act on M3 receptors. But because their metabolism profile is slightly different, so their stay time in the blood, their affinity to the receptor, the time they remain attached to the receptor is variable. That's why you can add on these drugs and have additive response. Then we had another drug called imidafenacin. Imidafenacin is another antimuscarinic. This is very popular in Japan. It is approved in Japan. And how it is different from other antimuscarinics? It is also M3 receptor selective. But somehow it has been seen that within the M3 receptors of salivary glands, colon, brain, and bladder, it has higher affinity to M3 receptors of urinary bladder. Just like if you were to shake hands with 4 people, with 3 you may not shake hands well, but with 4th you can shake hand with more affinity. You hold the hand longer. So that's what is the difference. And this another point is it has a very, very short half-life, few hours. So how do you exploit this short half-life? When you give the drug to the patient has good control on urinary bladder problem, but he may have a dry mouth, he may have a constipation. Both of them are very short lasting, right? But since the affinity to binding to the bladder is more, the bladder response remains. The control of OAB remains, but dry mouth and constipation vanishes very soon within the day. I hope I've made my point clear. So that is the advantage of imidafenacin because of short half-life. It is somehow Japanese company has not applied for FDA approval to US because of their policies and government policies. So we are waiting this arrival of imidafenacin in our country as well. Now, when you treat, now coming to the experience of using the antimuscarinic medication and treating these patients over the last so many years. There are patients we will have insufficient response. Whatever drug you give, one or two, add on, switch over, about nearly half the patients will have insufficient response because of various reasons. They default on their drug, they take them after the meal, their metabolism is bad, whatever. Then good number of patients are intolerant because of side effects, and some of them are even completely refractory. Some of them are completely refractory. So look at these three words: insufficient responder, intolerant, and refractory. So there are three categories of patients whom we see after using antimuscarinic on them. Then look at this box: elderly patients. Nearly one third, or a little more than that, patient group which come to us is elderly, more than 75 years. And when you give antimuscarinic to them, you are worried about long-term side effects like constipation, like urinary retention, like brain effects. And brain effects are very, very important. Then you must remember about impaired gastric emptying, in particularly in diabetics. And a large number of your patients will be diabetic. And if they're diabetic more than 15 years, you know they have problems with the gastric emptying and colonic emptying already. So how do you treat these people? And then there's a group of patients who will come to you and tell, doctor, I met Mrs. Khanna the other night. She has been your patient. She took a drug and she was horrible after the drug. She discontinued the drug and she told me, when I go to you, I must tell you that Mrs. Khanna is not taking your medicine at all. So this is what is new patients which learn from their neighbors, friends, and they get too concerned about their quality of life and impact of the drug on their life. So what I'm saying is there are people who either are not willing to take anticholinergics, or they are not responding to anticholinergics, or they are not suitable for anticholinergic therapy. For these people, research went on and we had this molecule, mirabegron, and I'm sure you are already using mirabegron. It increases bladder capacity by relaxing detrusor muscle through beta adrenoreceptor mechanisms. It relaxes the muscle in a manner that it does not affect the contractile function of urinary bladder. So there's no change in the voiding flow rates, no change in the residual urinary volume, and this drug is very useful. Mirabegron has, if I were to point out to you here, it's 150-fold higher affinity for beta-3 receptors. So it's selective to bladder and it shows very good response. Also, one more feature, there's an increase in the intervoid interval. The time between two voiding frequency is increased because the bladder capacity is increased. Now, there's certain points about pharmacodynamics of this drug which I thought I must share with you, so that you become a wiser person when you're using it. First of all, you should know that when you give the drug, only 30% of this is absorbed. Just think about it for a while. When you give 25 milligram dose, 30% is absorbed. And if you give 50 milligram dose, 35% is absorbed. So its absorption is dose dependent. This point you must remember. It is better, therefore, you give empty stomach. Okay. Although the company may say the food does not affect it, but since absorption is only so little, 30% from what is orally taken, be careful. The second point of importance is that the absorption is gender dependent. It is about 50% higher in females for some unknown reasons as compared to males. So when you treat a female, remember that out of the 25 milligram that you give, 50% will be absorbed, vis-a-vis in a man where 30% will be absorbed. I hope you understood this. Finally, food dependent, hampered but not clinically relevant as came in the papers, but absorption is hampered. I do not know how the studies looked at this data, but there's no harm in telling the patient take it empty stomach. Metabolism wise, it goes through cytochrome P450, and CYP3A is the first enzyme which will take it. And remember, if patient on inducers of this enzyme, like rifampicin, then this enzyme is higher in the liver. It will metabolize the drug faster, and the efficacy of drug will go down. Remember about ketoconazole. If patient is taking ketoconazole, it is inhibitor of this enzyme and the drug will accumulate in the body. So if you are treating a patient with GUTB and if the patient has some symptoms of overactivity of the urinary bladder and you're intending to give mirabegron, remember rifampicin can increase the blood levels. The another enzyme that metabolizes this drug is this CYP2D6. People have a lot of genetic polymorphism and therefore people differ in metabolizing capability, and because of this reason X patient responds well to the drug and Y patient does not respond well to the drug, right? Then remember that there are certain drugs which will increase this enzyme activity. Say, and tamsulosin is very important for us as a urologist to remember. Tamsulosin induces this enzyme to the degree of about 60%. So it will affect the blood levels of mirabegron. That you must know when you are treating tamsulosin or metoprolol for that matter, desimipramine. These are all very commonly drugs prescribed to this population. And finally, what about elimination? Both liver and kidney remove this mirabegron. So if you have a little advanced liver function dysfunction or renal dysfunction, be careful with the dose of this drug. The starting dose is 25 milligram with most people, but it must have been your experience that you don't get good response with 25 milligram and you add up to 50 milligram. Nearly 90% of my colleagues do it this way. Start at 25, call the patient after a week. If you're not responding, increase 50 milligram. But I want to have your attention on this line. This line. 25 milligram is effective within 8 weeks. Within 8 weeks. What does this mean? This means that if you start the drug today, patient may take 2 months to respond. And remember, our Indian patients do not have that much of patience. If they have visited a urologist, they have paid money for the consultation. They want to take tablet at 7 o'clock and be okay from 8 o'clock. That is the expectation. So how do you do this? So what I do, I exploit the second line. I do what? I start my patients on 50 milligram so that they show some response. They have confidence with the molecule. They have the confidence with the doctor. They're slightly better. And I call them, if they're better, I call them after a month and a half. And then I reduce their dose to 25 milligram. I do it other way around, completely other way around, as the most people do. Why do I do this? Because it saves the patient the money. Obviously, it is important for our country, and that's the way I do it. You may do whichever way you want. Then this product was launched. The problem with the most of the anticholinergics was that patients don't take it for very long because of side effects. And when mirabegron came, people studied the perseverance and persistence and adherence, and then they found that it's a good drug as far as that aspect is concerned. Although it is expensive, for 30 rupees a day prescription, but then people can take it because it's effective and does not show you so many side effects. This people had concern that because it's a beta agonist, it will have effect on the heart. But many studies were done. They showed that with the doses that we use, 25 milligram, 50 milligram, even 75 milligram, sometimes it does not show very significant cardiac adverse effects. It does not increase the rate of urinary retention in patients who have BPH, and it becomes a very, very important issue. A large number of your BPH patients will have overactivity symptoms. And there, if you give them tolterodine, next day morning, they can go in urinary retention. And I've treated a lot of patients of urinary retention induced by antimuscarinics. But this will not happen with mirabegron. And this has been shown in trials, in randomized trials, in urodynamic studies. So with this advantage of mirabegron, not much of constipation, not much of dry mouth, very effective drug with good persistence on therapeutic times, good tolerance by the patient. It came in the recommendation of EUA guidelines 2016 that you must offer this to the patient. But then since at that point of time, in the year 2016, We did not have long-term side effect data, long-term safety data. So the guidelines put it as you must warn patients about that we do not know long-term side effects. And there was one long-term side effect which was raised in one article, that gallbladder also has beta 3 receptors, and if you give beta 3 agonists, the gallbladder relaxes a bit, and you do not know how this kind of biliary stasis and gallbladder affect long-term use of mirabegron. But so far we have not heard of acute cholecystitis coming up more with mirabegron. So far not. This was in experimental animal studies, this was shown, but not in human beings. So when mirabegron has stood the test of time and it has shown efficacy, and since it had different mechanism of action, as you can see here, people thought of combining the both, solifenacin and mirabegron, and this was the Synergy study published in 2017, where it shows that if you combine both, there's a definite additive effect, and patient much better. So instead of you increasing the dose of solifenacin 5 to 10, you can give solifenacin 5 milligram and add up 25 milligram mirabegron or 50 milligram mirabegron, right? And when this was used, the EUA guidelines quickly included in their recommendations that this can be done this way. Then this was published recently in 2019 in European Urology, where they studied efficacy and safety of combination pharmacotherapy. Mind you, this combination. This is I'm saying about combination pharmacotherapy, right? This means This means mirabegron and solifenacin put together. And look at this thing. There have been 3 trials which tested it for 12 weeks, 3 months. Symphony, Synergy, and Beside. And then there was a randomized trial which tested for 12 months, the Synergy 2 and Synergy 2, right? So these trials, Synergy 2 is a long-term trial. It has shown that mirabegron plus solifenacin provides effective, well-tolerated treatment for patients with OAB, and you can use this effectively. This is another paper which came recently in 2020, where again they looked into both or independent, and they analyzed the data of all the trials came so far. 15 studies, randomized trial are included in this paper, and they have studied it, and they have put to rest several controversies which came from mirabegron. Say for instance, it said it increases the incidence of UTI. I don't know how, but then there were some reports that mirabegron therapy can increase urinary infection. This trial has set aside that controversy. It does not precipitate urinary retention. It does not sort of increase urinary infection in patients. Cardiac safety. Even though there have been many papers in past which said it is cardiac safe, people were not willing to accept it. And then it was found that those patients whose blood pressure is controlled on whatever therapy they are taking, if you give mirabegron, nothing happens. Only if you treat somebody who is uncontrolled hypertension, if you give this drug, there may be a problem. So this paper has looked into all these things. Then this is a pillar trial which has been done on patients who are elderly, more than 65 years of age. Looking into this only, cardiac safety at elderly age group, and then this said it's fine. And now, hold and behold, as science goes, there is a tendency to upgrade yourself. There's another drug coming up in the market with the name of Vibegron. Vibegron, there have been published paper on this. Vibegron, it is given the dose of 50 milligram and 100 milligram. It's from the group of mirabegron. And what is the difference? I have highlighted the difference in red circle. Look at this. When mirabegron has 150-fold higher affinity to beta 3, Vibegron has 9,000-fold higher affinity. Look at the difference. 150, 9,000. So you can imagine the potency and the selectivity of the drug. And as of today, The company which is making it, Eurovent Sciences, they have applied for US FDA patent approval, but as of today means March 2020 till last month, the FDA has accepted the application. Mind you, the word accepted the application. There are lots of criteria for acceptance also. They have passed all those hurdles, all those tests, and the application has gone in. It's just like getting your application accepted for green card in US. Your application accepted, but you're not granted green card. Same way, the FDA has not granted as of today approval to it, but I don't see any problem in it. Very soon you will have approval for it, and who knows, 2 years later you have another drug to play with to treat your patients more effectively. So friends, if you were to treat overactive bladder today, how do you go about this? You have anticholinergics, you have mirabegron family, you have combination, and you can do a lot of jugglery around and treat the patient. But when you treat the patient, remember, what is the challenge? Challenge here is that the patient concern is paramount. Concern about her own urinary problem. Somebody may be howling with one episode of urinary incontinence or urgency. The other person may be not worried about it, right? So you have to gauge the patient's concern about the problem, and then you have to treat. On a similar line, there's something called underreporting. Many patients are so just not concerned about it. Elderly ladies, they think it is because of age, not a disease. So they don't come to doctor. That's what is called underreporting. And that's a big challenge for us, that patients whom we can treat don't come to us. So society needs to be made aware. That's one challenge. And second challenge is compliance of the patient. Compliance because of side effects, compliance because of the cost. Cost is very vital in our country. And I also want you to remember one more thing here, that when you treat an elderly woman with overactive bladder, you may be very good with your prescription, with medicines, your sound knowledge of all this. But remember that when you're treating a lady, she has many things going on. One is menopausal status. Good half of them will have pelvic floor functional integrity problems along with their overactive bladder symptoms. And until and unless you ask about genital prolapse, they will not tell you about this. They respect their body image so much, they don't reveal this thing. And because of pelvic floor problems, they have some degree of less of youthful resistance, because of which a very minor amount of bladder contraction will manifest as leakage. So here you have to treat the pelvic floor. If you want, it is not frank stress incontinence, but it is a less youthful resistance, because of which they are having more OAB symptoms. This is because of menopausal hormone withdrawal. So remember this, that when you're treating an elderly person, there can be many hidden things which you have to tap. You may have to give additional hormone therapy. You may have to give additional pelvic floor therapy. You have to remember about comorbidities in this patient, like diabetes, obesity, hypothyroidism, knee joint pain, because of which she cannot walk to toilets in time. Polypharmacotherapy that they have, hepatic inducers, hepatic suppressors, so many things. The caretaker, there may be a lady looking after the old lady. This lady is washing the clothes and taking her to the toilet. She's very worried about the incontinence episodes. So you have to look into the totality of the clinical picture and then treat these patients. So in this age group, the challenge is even more. And I shared with you two challenges: challenges of consent of the patient, challenges about the compliance. And here I'd like to reiterate again that when you put the patient on pharmacotherapy and patient improves, you can reduce the dose of pharmacotherapy, and once they are confident that they are better, you can direct them towards the conservative treatments, the behavioral intervention that I said in the beginning. Have faith on behavioral intervention. The only problem is patients do not get convinced about it. Patients are not explained about it. They are not punctual, regular about it. Once they become punctual and regular about it, they can reduce the dose. There are many patients of mine who have stopped their anticholinergic medication completely, and they're fine. So thank you very much for listening to me for so long. and I'd be happy to have questions from you now. Over to Rahul.